The SS El Faro was a US-flagged cargo ship built in 1975 that carried a mix of containers and trailerized cargo. On September 29, 2015, she left the port of Jacksonville, Florida for San Juan, Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, it sailed right into the eye wall of Hurricane Joaquin, with winds reaching up to 140 miles per hour and waves over 50 feet high. And by October 1st, the ship and its 33 crew members were lost. The US Coast Guard started an extensive search operation, though all they managed to recover was some debris and a damaged lifeboat, and she was subsequently declared sunk, thus calling off the search. By the end of October, the wreck of the El Faro was discovered in one piece at a depth of 15,000 feet. In their final report, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, concluded that the sinking was caused by the captain's decision to sail right into the hurricane, despite the crew's objections. Other contributing factors included outdated weather information, mechanical issues, and delayed communications. The SS Eastland was a passenger steamer launched in 1903 that was used for tours around the city of Chicago, Illinois. On July 24, 1915, the ship, while tied to a dock in the Chicago River, was preparing to depart for a company picnic organized by Western Electric. Around 2,500 passengers boarded the ship, many of whom happened to be standing on the open upper decks, when suddenly she rolled onto her port side and became half submerged in the river. It resulted in one of the deadliest maritime disasters in US history, as a total of 844 people lost their lives, with many having become trapped below deck after the list. It was eventually determined that the disaster was caused by the ship's faulty, top-heavy construction, which was only made worse with the addition of new lifeboats in compliance with the Seamen's Act of 1915, a law that was designed to improve safety on ships as a reaction to the sinking of the Titanic 3 years earlier. Following the disaster, the Eastland was raised, recommissioned as the USS Wilmette, and operated during the two world wars as both a gunboat and a training ship until she was scrapped in 1947. During the latter half of the 13th century, naval forces assembled by the Mongol Empire under the rule of Kublai Khan attempted to conquer the Japanese archipelago in an effort to expand their empire. Their first try came in 1274 when they tried crossing the Korea Strait with a fleet of 900 ships and planned to start their invasion from the island of Kyushu. However, their efforts were in vain, as they were not only met with fierce resistance from the Japanese, but also suffered massive casualties as a result of typhoons, which were famously referred to as kamikaze or divine winds. The Mongols then tried again 7 years later in 1281, this time with a much larger fleet of approximately 3,500 ships crossing the East China Sea to reach Kyushu, and yet again they were completely overpowered by typhoons. After having tried 2 times in a row to conquer Japan and failing miserably both times, the Mongols ultimately decided to leave the Japanese islands alone, which is why Japan, unlike most of East Asia, barely received any Mongol influence whatsoever, and thus managed to preserve itself a lot more. The SS Cedarville was an American bulk carrier launched in 1927 that carried limestone across the Great Lakes. In the early morning of May 7, 1965, during a voyage from Rogers City, Michigan to Gary, Indiana, she was sailing through the Straits of Mackinac in heavy fog when she suddenly collided with the Norwegian vessel Toppdalsfjord as a result of miscommunication between the two ships. Despite the cruiser's attempts to beach the Cedarville, she ultimately capsized and sank, resulting in the deaths of 10 crew members, while the remaining 25 were picked up by the German freighter MV Weissenburg. Investigations later revealed that the Cedarville's captain, Martin Joppich, was to blame for the sinking due to his poor decision-making and delayed evacuation order. He was charged with 4 counts of faulty seamanship, pledged guilty in August 1965, and got his license suspended for a year. He later died in 1993 at the age of 82. The Cedarville is the 4th largest ship lost on the Great Lakes after the Edmund Fitzgerald, which I mentioned in Tier 1, the Daniel J Morel, and the Carl D. Bradley. The latter two we'll be talking about next. The SS Carl D. Bradley was a self-unloading Great Lakes freighter built in 1927 that held the title of Queen of the Lakes for 22 years as the largest freighter on the Great Lakes. She sank on November 18, 1958 during a severe storm on Lake Michigan. The ship was en route to its winter port of Rogers City, Michigan, carrying a load of stone, when it encountered gale-force winds and towering waves, causing the vessel to break in two and sink. Of the 35 crew members aboard, only 2 survived. 23 of the victims were from Rogers City, the ship's original destination, which deeply affected the town and its community. Furthermore, the bodies of 15 victims remain missing to this day. The following investigation by the US Coast Guard revealed that the ship sank due to hogging caused by the ship's age. Hogging refers to the stress a ship's hull experiences that causes the center of the ship to bend upward or downward. This bend is ultimately what led the ship to split in two. The wreck was eventually discovered a year after the sinking at a max depth of 380 feet or 116 meters. The SS Daniel J Morel, the last of the 3 Great Lakes ships on this tier, was yet another Great Lakes freighter, launched in 1906. On November 29, 1966, the 60-year-old ship, which was en route to Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, while carrying iron ore, was caught in a powerful storm on Lake Huron and, just like the Carl D. Bradley and many other Great Lakes ships before her, split in two and sank, killing all but 1 of her 29 crewmen. The lone survivor was 26-year-old Dennis Hale, who endured nearly 40 hours in frigid waters before being rescued. He later died of cancer in 2015, aged 75. The subsequent Coast Guard investigation concluded that she sank due to the age of the ship's hull, which was a common problem for Great Lakes ships built before 1948. I believe this entry is specifically referring to the HMS Victory built in 1737, as there are a lot of ships throughout history that were named HMS Victory. This was a British Royal Navy warship, a so-called first-rate ship of the line, that carried over 100 guns. On October 4th, 1744, while returning to England, she and her 1,150 sailors, including Admiral Sir John Balchan, were lost in a storm near the Channel Islands. Following this, frigates were sent to search for the Victory, which led to them discovering that wreckage of the ship had washed up on the shores of the islands of Guernsey, Jersey, and Alderney. For over 260 years, it was widely believed that the ship was wrecked near the Cascades, a group of rocks northwest of Alderney, and that the ship carried loads of gold and silver, which, if salvaged today, could be worth hundreds of millions of pounds. In 2008, the Tampa-based company Odyssey Marine Exploration discovered the wreck more than 80 kilometers away from the Cascades, meaning it did not actually sink near them, contrary to what was widely believed for the past 260 years. In March 2009, the TV show Treasure Quest aired an episode that featured footage of their initial discovery of the wreck and the recovery of 2 of its bronze cannons. The Empress of Ireland was a British-built Canadian ocean liner owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway that was launched in 1906 and operated between Quebec City, Canada and Liverpool, England. She tragically sank on May 29, 1914 during her 96th voyage starting from Quebec City, after the Norwegian coal ship Storstad, which sighted the ship just moments before, struck the Empress on her starboard side in dense fog in the St. Lawrence River. Within just 14 minutes, the ship capsized on her starboard side and sank, while the Storstad received some damage to its bow but remained afloat and managed to rescue survivors, one of whom being the Empress's captain, Henry Kendall, who confronted the Storstad's captain, Thomas Anderson, and told him, quote, "You have just sunk my ship." Of the 1,477 people aboard, 1,012 went down with the ship, making it the worst peacetime maritime disaster in Canadian history. The Commission of Inquiry, held in Quebec a month later, received two very different accounts of the collision from the two ships' respective crews, who made each other responsible for the sinking. After 11 days, the commission came to no other conclusion than that the Storstad was responsible for the collision due to her change in course to starboard. Despite this, Captain Anderson still denied responsibility and would later file an unsuccessful lawsuit against Canadian Pacific Rail. Shortly after the disaster, mail and bodies were recovered from the wreck, which lies at a shallow depth of 130 feet or 40 meters. The wreck was later revisited by divers in the 1960s and 1970s, and by 1999, it was declared a site of historical and archaeological importance and was listed in the Register of Historic Sites of Canada. The MV Donia P was a Japanese-built, Philippine-registered passenger ferry launched in 1963 as the Himeyuri Maru before she was sold in 1975 to Sulpicio Lines and renamed Don Sulpicio before being renamed again 4 years later to Donia P. On the morning of December 20th, 1987, the ship, while carrying over 4,000 people, which far exceeded its official capacity, left the port of Tacloban on Leyte Island for Manila, the capital of the Philippines. During the late evening, however, as the ship was crossing the Tablas Strait, she suddenly collided with the empty Vector, an oil tanker that carried highly flammable gasoline and other petroleum products, which ignited upon impact, causing a massive fire that quickly engulfed both vessels and the surrounding waters, which also happened to be infested with sharks. Panic erupted on the Donia P, as there were no life jackets available, while none of the crew gave any orders whatsoever, thus forcing passengers to jump into the flaming, shark-infested waters. The Donia P sank after 2 hours, while the Vector sank within 4 hours. Tragically, only 24 people, with most of whom having sustained major burns, survived, making it the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history, with over 4,300 people having lost their lives. Investigations later revealed that, at the time of the accident, only one apprentice member of the Donia P's crew was present on the ship's bridge, while the others, including the captain, were busy drinking beer, watching TV, and partying. Despite this, official blame was put on the Vector, which was found to be unseaworthy and to be operating without a license. The wrecks of both the Donia P and the Vector were discovered upright and in good condition in April 2019, lying at a depth of 500 meters or 1,600 feet. The Essex was an American whale ship originating from the island of Nantucket, Massachusetts, that was launched in 1799. On November 20th, 1820, while sailing through the southern Pacific Ocean, about 2,000 nautical miles from the coast of South America, the ship was attacked and subsequently sunk by a sperm whale. The 20 surviving crew members ended up being left stranded in small whaleboats with what food and water they could salvage from the ship. After spending a month all alone at sea, the crew landed on the uninhabited Henderson Island. 3 men stayed on the island and were later rescued in April 1821, while the remaining 17 continued their journey to South America. Over the course of the next 3 months, they faced starvation, dehydration, and exposure, all in the middle of the ocean. In a desperate bid for survival, some even ended up resorting to cannibalism. By the time they were rescued in February 1821, only 8 men survived, including the 3 men left on Henderson Island. 2 of the survivors, first mate Owen Chase and cabin boy Thomas Nickerson, later wrote their accounts of the harrowing ordeal down. The event later inspired famed author Herman Melville to write his most famous novel, Moby Dick, which was released in 1851. As of 2024, the wreck of the Essex has yet to be found. On the morning of April 16, 1947, in the port of Texas City, Texas, a fire broke out aboard the French-registered ship SS Grand Camp, which was carrying approximately 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate, a highly explosive chemical used in fertilizers that was intended for export to farmers in Europe. Despite efforts by the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department to extinguish the fire, at 9:12 a.m., the cargo suddenly exploded, causing utter destruction within a radius of 2,000 feet, as well as a shock wave that was felt over 100 miles away in a 15-foot or 4.6 meter tall tsunami. The blast also triggered fires and additional explosions in nearby ships and industrial chemical facilities, including a nearby ship named the SS Highflyer that was also carrying ammonium nitrate and subsequently exploded as well at 1:10 a.m. the following day. In the end, the disaster caused the deaths of 581 people, including all but 1 member of the volunteer fire department, injuries in around 5,000 people, and around $100 million in property damage, which would be equivalent to around $1 billion today. The cause of the fire on the Grand Camp was never able to be determined, though it was speculated that it may have been started by a discarded cigarette, and that it only managed to spread as much as it did due to human error. Finally, the disaster also caused the first class action lawsuit against the US government to be filed on behalf of 8,485 plaintiffs who sought compensation, which eventually led to the government being found responsible for negligence in the manufacture, packaging, and labeling of ammonium nitrate. The Sultana was a commercial side-wheel steamboat built in 1863 in Cincinnati, Ohio, for service on the mighty Mississippi River. The ship began its final voyage from St. Louis, Missouri to New Orleans, Louisiana on April 13, 1865, a month before the end of the American Civil War. 2 days later, she was tied up in Cairo, Illinois, when word reached the city that US President Abraham Lincoln had been shot, which subsequently led the ship to start spreading the news during the remainder of the voyage into the South, as well as take on around 2,000 Union soldiers recently released from Confederate prison camps, despite the ship having a legal capacity of only 376 people. On April 27th, at 2 a.m., while she was about 7 miles or 11 kilometers north of Memphis, Tennessee, the overloaded ship's boilers violently exploded, killing many people instantly and throwing other people into the waters. The resulting fire led its decks to start collapsing due to the ship having been built out of wood. The burning Sultana eventually drifted to the west bank of the river and sank at 7 a.m., taking the lives of an estimated 1,167 people, thus making it the deadliest maritime disaster in US history. The official causes of the disaster were later determined to be both the mismanagement of water levels in the boilers and the ship having become very top-heavy due to it having carried way more people than it was built for. Although, many people later came out claiming that the ship was actually sabotaged, despite there not being a lot of evidence to prove these points. Despite the severity of the disaster, no one was ever formally held accountable. Finally, in 1982, an archaeological expedition uncovered what was believed to be the wreckage of the Sultana. The Yamato was a Japanese battleship that was renowned as the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever built. Commissioned in 1941 during World War II, it was the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Yamato boasted an extraordinary size, with a displacement of over 70,000 tons and 9 18.1-inch guns, making it the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. Though, despite its intimidating design, the Yamato barely saw any use during the war, as Japan's naval strategy started shifting towards air power. In April of 1945, the Yamato embarked on a suicide attack mission known as Operation Tengo in an attempt to defend the Okinawa Islands from American forces, during what is now known as the Battle of Okinawa. However, she ended up being outnumbered and attacked by American aircraft, as she was without air cover. Then, after having become overwhelmed by bombs and torpedoes, the Yamato, along with 5 other Japanese warships, capsized, exploded, and sank on April 7th. Between 3,700 and 4,250 Japanese naval personnel were killed during the battle. Tengo ended up being Japan's last naval operation before the country surrendered on September 2, 1945, thus ending World War II. The Mary Celeste was an American merchant brigantine launched in Nova Scotia, Canada in 1861 under the name Amazon. On November 7, 1872, she left New York City for a voyage to Genoa, Italy, while carrying 1,701 barrels of alcohol. However, 1 month later, on December 4th, the Canadian ship De Gracia discovered the Mary Celeste adrift and abandoned in the Atlantic Ocean off the Azorian Islands. The vessel itself was in good, seaworthy condition with its cargo intact, but the crew, including the captain, his family, and 7 sailors, were completely missing and never found. The ship's last log entry was dated 10 days earlier, and no signs of struggle or foul play were ever found. During the subsequent salvage hearings held in Gibraltar, multiple possible reasons for abandonment were considered, including mutiny by the Mary Celeste's crew, piracy by the De Gracia's crew, and conspiracy to carry out insurance or salvage fraud, but there was no evidence to support any of these claims, thus leaving the case unsolved. Since then, further theories have proposed that the effects of alcohol fumes on the crew, submarine earthquakes, water spouts, an attack by a giant squid, and even paranormal events caused the ship's abandonment, but once again, none of these were ever able to be proven. After her discovery, she continued in service under new owners until 1885, when she was deliberately wrecked off the coast of Haiti as part of an attempted insurance fraud. In August 2001, some of the ship's remains were supposedly discovered, though experts later concluded that they were just the remains of trees and not the Mary Celeste. The MV Vilhelm Gustof was a German cruise ship that was originally built in 1937 as part of the Nazi German government's Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy, leisure organization. However, only 2 years after her construction, she was recommissioned by the Kriegsmarine and served as a hospital ship, and later, as part of Operation Hannibal, as a floating barracks to carry evacuated civilians from East Prussia and the German-occupied Baltic states as the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east. On January 30th, 1945, the ship left the port of Gotenhafen, nowadays known as Gdynia in Poland, while carrying around 10,000 people, most of whom being civilians, which caused the ship to be severely overcrowded, as the ship was designed to carry only around 2,000 people. Later that night, she was spotted by the Soviet submarine S-13 and subsequently torpedoed 3 times on her port side, causing her to capsize and sink in the icy waters of the Baltic Sea in 50 minutes. Based on estimates, over 9,600 people ended up losing their lives, thus making the sinking of the Vilhelm Gustof the worst disaster involving a single ship in maritime history. The wreck is located at a depth of 42 meters or 138 feet in Polish waters and is now designated as a war grave. Because it has attracted a lot of attention from treasure hunters searching for the lost amber room, the Polish Maritime Office has forbidden diving within a 500 meter or 1,600 foot radius of the wreck. Here we are at the final entry of the second layer. The SS Central America, nicknamed the Ship of Gold, was an American sidereal steamship launched in 1852, originally under the name SS George Law, that operated between Central America and the US East Coast during the 1850s. On September 9, 1857, during a voyage from Colon, Panama to New York City, the ship, while carrying 578 passengers and crew and 30,000 pounds of gold from the California Gold Rush, was caught up in a Category 2 hurricane off the coast of North Carolina and sank 3 days later, taking the lives of 425 people. The loss of its massive cargo of gold ended up contributing to a financial crisis known as the Panic of 1857, as the gold the ship was carrying was intended for banks and investors. It was later determined that the ship sank due to engine failure and that the crew desperately tried to fix the engines and keep her afloat during the calm of the hurricane, but to no avail. Finally, in 1988, the wreck was discovered by a search team led by treasure hunter Tommy Gregory Thompson, who recovered significant amounts of gold and artifacts that were valued at around $100 to $150 million, though he ended up getting sued by 39 insurance companies that claimed that they had the right to it due to having paid damages in the 19th century for the lost gold. After a legal battle, 92% of the gold was awarded to Thompson and his team, though he would end up getting into more legal battles throughout the 2000s and 2010s.